Draco Malfoy, and why in Merlin's name is it always Harry? But Draco will hear about this. Chapter 6 of Dragons and Weasels. The week following Harry's nomination as champion was, quite frankly, hell. For one, most of the school, save the Gryffindor house, turned against Harry, judging him both for alleged cheating and stealing the real champion's thunder. Especially Nott was insufferable, insulting Harry left and right, edged on by the additional detention Draco received for hexing them after they were found. But for once he was not the only one. It all spiraled out of control when Rita Skeeter published a horrible article about Harry's participation in the tournament, turning him into the joke of the school. The worst for Harry, though, was very clearly Weasley's betrayal, while for Draco, Weasley was worse than dead. His friend very clearly hoped deep inside that the other boy would still somehow come around and apologize. It was written all over his face how much he missed him, even if he tried to play it off as anger, and if anything, that made Draco even more furious with the red-headed git. Harry had enough on his mind. Merlin knew he did not need freaking Weasley to put a bloody cherry on the top. Hermione, on the other hand, desperately tried to mediate between them and became more exasperated with their lack of compliance every time her efforts hit a wall. The adults around them weren't as much of a help as Draco had originally hoped either. Sirius, when he finally answered, told Harry to meet him for a chat on November 22nd at 1 a.m. in the Gryffindor common room. Apart from the obvious question, which was about Sirius's sanity when he was evidently planning to enter the bloody school for a chat with his godson despite the sum on his head, Draco was frustrated that they couldn't expect any support from him until 2 days before the first task. How the heck was that to help Harry in any way? His mother's letter was no more helpful. She claimed to not have noticed any changes in his father's behavior, though it is difficult to notice anything about him when I usually make a conscious effort to be on the other side of the manor at any given time of the day, an art that I perfected in the last couple of months, if I may say so myself. She promised to interrogate the house elves, but Draco doubted that would yield any results. After Dobby, his father had learned his lessons about entrusting the help with incriminating information. After some more nagging without a satisfactory response, Draco finally took it into his own hands to contact Professor Lupin. The answer came rather promptly, at least, though it was far from the treasure vault of answers Draco had hoped for. Dear Draco, I heard about Harry's situation from Dumbledore, and I have to admit that I am very concerned. We all are. As for now, no one seems to be sure of who is plotting against Harry and why, but please let me assure you that it is being investigated. As for the tournament itself, I am sorry to disappoint you. Dumbledore has not entrusted me with any details regarding the tasks, and I am not blessed with an extensive network of contacts that would help me find out. In general, I would advise Harry to practice defensive spells as much as he can. Otherwise, we can just hope for the best. I am sorry that I can't be more of a help, Draco. If you should feel the need to talk to anyone, though, I will be here to answer your letters, I promise. Sincerely, Remus Lupin. So, to say Draco was a nervous wreck would be the understatement of the year. He spent all of his time in the library with Harry and Hermione, and in between their mountains of homework, they researched defensive spells that could be of use to Harry in the tournament. Sometimes they were joined by Viktor Krum, though he talked even less around Harry and Hermione than he did when it was only him and Draco at the Slytherin table. Still, considering how the rest of the school treated Harry, and by extension Draco and Hermione, he was amazed by the effort the Durmstrang student put forth to get along with his direct rival. It had been the Monday morning after Halloween when Draco had first come face to face with him again after the announcement. Viktor had seemed unsure about whether he was welcome to sit with Draco or not. He had stood across from him awkwardly, a frown on his face, as he studied Draco. The Slytherin had bristled at his hesitancy and spat out, Harry didn't put his name in. If you think he did, you can move right on, you know. Viktor had wavered for a moment, frown deepening in thought before he nodded once and sat down in his usual seat. Okay, was all he'd said, leaving Draco to gape at him. Okay, he'd repeated. Just like that? Viktor had shrugged and said, You are his best friends, are you not? If you say he did not do it, I will take your word for it. I do not know him. I cannot judge. It was at that moment, with a fierce rush of gratitude, that Draco had decided that Viktor Krum was his friend. So the next time they had crossed ways at the library, he'd waved them over to their table, much to the surprise of both Harry and Hermione, as well as Viktor himself. He had not let it deter him, though, introducing them all to each other and assuring Viktor that he was welcome to sit with them any time he wanted. Hermione had vented at him about that later. "How can we study in peace when he is around? Have you seen the hordes of fans following him everywhere?" But nobody had directly disagreed, and so it had become natural for Viktor to join them a couple of times a week, studying quietly in their midst. It satisfied Draco to think about how much Weasley would be raging every time he saw them together. By the week before the first test, though, all their nerves were lying bare. Harry became more and more irritable and taciturn, while Draco could not seem to be able to stop talking in circles, a tendency that Hermione thankfully shared. "Aren't you nervous at all?" Draco asked Viktor Friday evening at dinner. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." "Worrying won't help," Viktor shrugged. "I could do my best and hope it is enough. Quidditch, the tournament, it is the same everywhere." "I wished I could do that," Draco sighed, pushing his potatoes back and forth on his plate moodily. "I don't even care about the outcome of the tournament, really. I just want Harry to come out of it alive. No offense," he added quickly, making Viktor smile for a moment. "Don't take it," he assured him. "Potter has it hard. He is young, younger than the rest of us." "Someone is out to get him," Draco sighed. "We just don't know who it is, and the tournament will be the perfect opportunity to hurt him." Viktor did not say anything, but he was frowning, watching Draco thoughtfully. "Anyways," Draco shrugged, changing the subject, "are you coming to Hogsmeade tomorrow?" "Hogsmeade?" Viktor asked, puzzled. "Oh, you wouldn't know," Draco realized, shaking his head. "Hogwarts students are allowed to visit the village on the other side of the lake every couple of weekends. Maybe you could come with us? We could show you around." "I would like that." Viktor nodded. "Are you going?" "Yes, me, Harry, and Hermione," he clarified. "Why? You don't have a problem with Harry, do you?" "No," Viktor replied quickly. "Just wondering. I thought maybe Potter and his girlfriend would want to be alone." "His girlfriend?" Draco blinked, confused. "What do you—" He remembered Rita Skeeter's article then, and her implication about Harry and Hermione, and rolled his eyes. "Hermione and Harry aren't together," he told him. "That awful reporter made all of that up. They aren't interested in each other like that, believe me." "Oh," Viktor frowned, looking at him intently. "Then you want her—" "No!" Draco called, scandalized. "Merlin, no! Hermione is brilliant, but that would be like dating a sister." He shuddered. "I see," Viktor said, and something flickered over his face. It was then that Draco remembered the furtive looks he'd seen the older boy throwing at Hermione over the table at the library, and something clicked together in his head. "Wait," he asked, eyes whitening. "Do you like Hermione?" Viktor cleared his throat and studied his half-empty plate with immense interest. "But you never talked to her!" Draco blurted out before remembering Ginny and her embarrassed silence whenever she was in Harry's presence. "Oh, yeah. I guess that's why, then." "I don't know what to say," Viktor grumbled, and Draco could spot the slight flush on his face. "And I thought she was with Potter." "Well, she's not," Draco smiled. "So maybe make an effort to talk to her from now on. Hermione isn't someone to be impressed by your fame or your skills on the pitch. You'll have to actually talk to win her over."
"You think I have a chance?"
Viktor asked, finally looking at Draco again. "Honestly, I have no idea," Draco admitted, grimacing an apology. "We've never talked about her taste in boys before, and she's never shown any particular interest in anyone. But why not? Be nice and show some enthusiasm for elf rights. You might have a shot."
"Elf rights?"
Viktor asked, looking confused. "Ask her about it," Draco laughed. "It will give you something to talk about." And this was how they ended up in the Three Broomsticks the next afternoon, the four of them occupying a table while Hermione introduced Viktor on the long-term aims of SPEW. Draco sat across from Harry, watching as his friend stared darkly into space, pointedly ignoring Weasley sitting with his brothers on the other side of the room. It had taken a lot of pleading to talk Harry into coming out with them at all. He had been set on staying in the castle at first, and then he had insisted on using his invisibility cloak.
Only Viktor coming along had made him drop that idea, but his fear had been proven correct when they had spent the first part of the day dodging Rita Skeeter in the streets. "I thought today would be a good distraction," Draco sighed, finally making Harry look up at him. "I'm sorry. Maybe it was stupid to force you into coming with us."
"That is not your fault."
Harry made a face.
"I know you just wanted to help. You always do."
Draco reached out his hand, and Harry took it without thought, entwining their fingers. "Sirius might have some insights when you talk to him tonight," Draco whispered so lowly that only Harry could hear him.
"When he doesn't get caught in the attempt to see me, you mean?"
Harry muttered. Draco grimaced and shrugged awkwardly, but he was kept from answering when Hagrid and Professor Moody turned up at their table. He could see the good eye of their DADA professor linger on the way their hands were linked, but Draco refused to let go, jaw set. "Hello, Professor," he said politely. "Hello, Hagrid."
Hello, kiddos.
Hagrid smiled. Moody ignored Draco completely, instead leaning over the table to look at the SPEW materials Hermione had spread out over the table. It distracted both Hermione and Viktor enough that they did not notice when Hagrid leaned down to whisper to Harry. Draco leaned in as well and was just able to catch his words.
Alright, make me tonight at me cabin. Where the cloak?
Before Harry could return anything, though, they were bidding their goodbyes and leaving both Harry and Draco to stare after them in confusion. "What was that about?" Draco asked under his breath when Hermione and Viktor had returned to their conversation.
"I don't know,"
Harry muttered.
"He's never asked me to come see him that late at night."
"Maybe he wants to tip you off about the first task," Draco whispered, hope rising deep within him. "Maybe he heard something and wants to tell you."
"You think?"
Harry frowned, looking unsure. "It's possible," Draco shrugged. "You should go, I think. Hear what he has to say."
"What about Sirius?"
Harry asked, lowering his voice even more.
Oh,
Draco said, biting his lip in thought as he remembered the appointment Harry had with his godfather just an hour after Hagrid had asked to meet him. "Well, you'll have to hurry then." When Harry came down for breakfast the next morning, he quickly gathered up both Draco and Hermione to take a walk over the grounds and tell them what had happened the previous night. Hagrid had shown Harry to a settling of dragons deep in the forest, freshly delivered from Romania by the hands of Charlie Weasley and his colleagues. Apparently, the core of the first task was to get past these dragons somehow. Draco felt faint at these news, but he had no time to recover as Harry continued telling them about Sirius and how he had warned him about Karkaroff's Death Eater past. Draco was less surprised about this part. He had been aware of Karkaroff's connection to his father, after all, but the way Sirius had spun the net from the Durmstrang headmaster to an alleged attack on Moody before he had started his teaching job at Hogwarts, the happenings at the World Cup, and to a Ministry witch disappearing in Albania where Voldemort was last rumored to be hiding, terrified Draco more than he could put into words. Hermione's approach, though, was more practical. "Let's just try and keep you alive until Tuesday evening," she said briskly. "And then we can worry about Karkaroff." It appeared that Sirius had been about to explain to him how he could subdue a dragon with the help of one simple spell, but he had been interrupted by Weasley, of all people, who had heard some noise from the common room and had come to investigate, cutting their conversation short. Draco was still raging about Weasley. "His brother brought the damn dragons here, and he did not think it necessary to drop you a warning!" As they entered the library, ready to comb it for any spells that could help Harry get past a dragon. He held in, though, when he spotted Viktor studying quietly at one of the tables not far from a group of admirers. He caught Harry's wrist and caught his eyes. "Harry," he whispered, "I think you should tell Viktor what you know."
"I think he knows already," Harry answered. "Karkaroff saw the dragons, as well as Madame Maxine. He was there last night."
"Still," Draco frowned, "I think it's fair to even the field. Dragons are no joke. Imagine if he gets seriously hurt and we could have prevented it."
"Okay,"
Harry nodded, biting his lip in thought, and then adding,
"You think I should tell Diggory too? After all, he seems to be the only one left completely in the dark."
Draco made a face.
His dislike for Jiggery battled for the sense of fairness Draco had without a doubt caught from Harry, and he sighed as the latter went over. "Yes," he nodded, "I think you should." Harry hummed in agreement and then went over to ask Viktor for a word alone. Hermione and Draco, meanwhile, filed out through the shelves in search of books about dragons. They spent the whole afternoon in the library going through all kinds of spell books and reference books about dragons they could get their hands on with limited success. They all took some more books up to their quarters and Draco stayed up half the night reading, but he came across nothing that would be of any use for Harry. He tried to suppress the rising panic inside of him best he could. It had to be possible, after all, and Sirius had said a simple spell would do. All they had to do was find it. It wasn't until Monday, when he met up with his friends for care of magical creatures, that they presented him with an answer so obvious and easy that he wanted to hit himself for not thinking of it right away.
It was Moody who gave me the idea,
Harry explained in hushed whispers as they made their way down to Hagrid's hut.
All I need is to practice the summoning charm to summon my firebolt, and then I can outfly the dragon.
But isn't a summoning charm the one you've been failing at for weeks? Draco muttered, his stomach falling. It's not that difficult of a spell, though, Hermione quipped from Harry's other side. If we put all our strength into it, I'm sure Harry will be able to do it by tomorrow afternoon. So that's what they did. They skipped lunch to practice with Harry, and when he hadn't gotten the hang of it by the time their next classes started, Draco decided to skip arithmancy to stay with Harry and practice, much to Hermione's disapproval, but she knew better than to try and sway Draco's decision, much less Harry's. When by the time Hermione returned, Harry had still not made as much progress as Draco would have liked, she forced them to have some dinner before they searched for an empty classroom and continued. They only retreated to their dormitories around midnight, chased away by beeves, but by then Draco was pretty sure Harry would be fine. It had taken some time, but he had grown better steadily, and when they parted he had successfully cast the spell about a handful of times, and with some more practice up at the Gryffindor common room with Hermione, he was bound to be well prepared for the next day. Still, Draco was restless, turning and tossing throughout the night, and getting up at the break of dawn, unable to stay still any longer. He walked the castle, visited Aquila and Hedwig in the owlry, and when it was finally time for breakfast, he sat at the Gryffindor table with Harry and Hermione, the need to be close to them too overwhelming to resist. He suffered through a double session of Defense Against the Dark Arts and Moody's incessant taunting, and returned to the Gryffindor table for lunch, sitting so close to Harry that their shoulders were brushing whenever one of them moved, right up to the point when Professor McGonagall came over to pick him up and take him away. Draco pulled him into a tight hug before they parted, whispering words of encouragement and pleading with him to be careful, and then he finally forced himself to let go of his friend. He watched him leave with a troubled expression, panic bubbling inside of him. He had never just sat back and watched Harry walk into danger. In the past, he had always been there with him. "He'll be fine," Hermione whispered, taking Draco's hand and squeezing it tightly. "We did all we could. He's got the spell down. Now we can just hope for the best." Draco nodded, taking deep, steadying breaths and squeezing her fingers in return. Across the hall he caught Viktor's eyes as he was following after Karkaroff on their way out of the castle. Draco smiled at him and mouthed well wishes. Viktor smiled back and nodded before he, too, disappeared out of sight. When they followed the crowds down into the forest not long after, Draco was a nervous wreck. Hermione had hooked her arm through his, though whether it was for her own comfort or to keep Draco from fidgeting, he had no idea. They did not talk on the way, both tense and anxious, and no one else approached them either, though both Longbottom and Ginny followed right after them, watching them closely. When they finally reached the clearing where the dragons were kept, Draco saw that something like a makeshift stadium had been erected for the occasion. Students were filing into the stands, and Draco let Hermione lead him towards a pair of free seats without paying attention, his eyes instead wandering over the spouts of flames that kept appearing between the trees south of the stands and the big white tent in which the champions were supposedly being instructed for the task ahead. Hermione almost pushed Draco into his seat, and only then did he realize that they were surrounded by the Weasley family. Ginny was sitting to his left, probably having followed after them, and in the seats in front of them sat the twins and their friend Jordan, as well as Weasley with Thomas, Finnegan, and Longbottom. Draco glared at the back of Weasley's head with half a mind to snap something at him in order to relieve some of his tension, but Hermione's eyes on his face stopped him. Instead, he watched as helpers, among them Charlie Weasley, led the first dragon into the enclosure. It was a Swedish short snout. Draco knew a bit about dragons, his name having caused a fascination with them in his childhood, so he was able to identify the most common ones. He watched as the dragon settled over a nest of eggs, watching the crowds with suspicion, the blue of her hide shining in the light. Then the jury began to settle in the designated area almost straight across from them. Dumbledore, Karkaroff, Maxime, Crouch, and then, last of all, Bagman. Bagman cast a sonorous charm upon himself, the way he had done at the Quidditch World Cup, and his voice boomed through the cheering. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first task of the Triwizard Tournament!" The crowds cheered in response, and it made Draco sick. How could they all feel so excited about this when Draco was about to throw up in fear? "For this first round, we are going to test the champions' daring and nerves. Each of them has been randomly assigned one dragon to face. Their task is to snatch the golden egg from the nest their dragon is guarding. Points will be awarded to each champion by every member of the jury after their turn, 10 being the highest mark to give. But enough talk now. Let's call in the first of our champions." Hermione reached out to link their hands, clinging to Draco as they both held their breaths. "The first one to get his turn will be Cedric Diggory," Bagman announced. Crouch blew into a whistle, and then Diggory stepped out into the enclosure. Draco had felt a fierce dislike for Diggory ever since he had been defeated by him on the pitch, but now, as he saw the older boy step out to face the dragon, he found that none of that mattered. Maybe he could have approached this whole tournament differently had he not been so emotionally invested. Maybe he could have sat on the edge of his seat in excitement, cheering for Viktor and booing for Diggory instead of feeling paralyzed with fear and worry. Now, though, he just wished for no one to get hurt. Not even Diggory. Draco watched as Diggory stood apparently glued to the spot, watching the dragon as she hissed and squirmed, ready to attack the moment he approached her. It seemed to take an immense effort for the Hufflepuff to tear his eyes away from the beast and let them travel over the ground of the enclosure. Draco was unsure of what he was searching for, until Diggory held in, gauging a medium-sized rock halfway between the dragon and him. Then he pointed his wand at it and called, "Force!" The effect was immediate. The rock turned into a grey Labrador, which whined and quivered in front of the dragon. The dragon hissed in a threatening manner, and when the dog still didn't move, she spewed red flames at it. Barking, the Labrador ran into the opposite direction, and the dragon rose from her position and into the air, taking off after the dog. This left the path clear for Diggory, who immediately sprinted for the nest in a hurry to get his hands on the golden egg. The dragon, though, came to a halt when it registered the sound of footsteps. She turned in the air and let out an angry cry at the sight of Diggory so close to her precious eggs. She dove back down at him, and the nest, fueled by rage, and spewed a tongue of fire in Diggory's direction. Diggory lunged for the egg, and then flames covered him from sight. At his sides, Hermione and Ginny screamed. He could hear Weasley yell something from his seat, sounding horrified. Draco closed his eyes, unable to look. When the crowds started cheering, though, he opened them again to find Diggory on his feet, the egg in hand. His robes were smoking, and patches of his skin had clearly been burned red and raw, but apart from that, he seemed unharmed. The dragon keepers hurried forward to subdue the dragon, and Professor Smout met Diggory at the entrance of the enclosure, rushing him into the white tent in a motherly manner. He only returned minutes later, a healing paste dabbed onto his wounds, and Bagman was interrupted in his analysis of Diggory's performance to announce the marks from the judges. Madame Maxime was the first to raise her wand into the air, and a large silvery 8 appeared above her head. The other judges followed her example. Crouch marked Diggory with 7 points, as did Bagman, while Dumbledore and Karkaroff both joined Maxime with 8 points each. Automatically, Draco did the math in his head. 38 out of 50 points for Diggory. Not bad. The dragon keepers were now leading the second dragon into the enclosure. This one was entirely green from head to toe, and Draco recognized her as a common Welsh green.
1 down, 3 to go!
Bagman called, far too cheerful for Draco's liking, as Crouch blew his whistle once more.
Miss Delacour, if you please.
The girl was incredibly pale as she entered the enclosure, trembling as she clutched her wand. As frightened as she was, though, her pose was proud and determined, and it took her only a moment to slip into action. She pointed her wand at the dragon, who hissed at her in response, but not for long. The spell she used was non-verbal, but as soon as the magic hit the creature, it began to sway. Draco, despite his tension, was quite impressed as he watched the dragon's eyes droop, and with an exaggerated yawn, she made herself comfortable on the ground next to her eggs curled in on herself, her head resting on her front legs. The Beauxbatons champion stood, watching for a moment longer as the dragon dropped off into a deep sleep. Only when she was sure that her spell had taken full effect did she move towards the eggs. It would have gone splendidly indeed had the dragon not started snoring the moment she bent down to pick up the golden egg. With the soft snore of the creature, fire spilled out of her nostrils, and Delacour's robes caught fire. She yelped, jumping back, hastened to put the fire out with a well-aimed aguamenti. She was more careful after that, taking a moment to observe the breathing pattern of the dragon and moving forward only when the dragon was sure to breathe in. She managed to evade the flames on her second attempt and proudly presented the golden egg to the jury. The crowd cheered, and Draco took a shaky breath. Hermione squeezed his hand. Delacour, like Diggory, escaped to the tent for a few moments, led there by Professor Flitwick, only to return a moment later to receive her marks. From her own head mistress, she was awarded 9 points, which did not surprise Draco in the slightest. To him, having the heads of each school as part of the jury was a ridiculous tradition, sure to end in an unfair ranking, because naturally they would never throw their own champion under a bus. Delacour might have earned her points this time around, but he was quite sure that Maxime would still have awarded her the same marks had her pretty face been jarred to coal. Crouch, Dumbledore, and Karkaroff both marked her the same they had for Diggory, 7, 8, and 8. But Bagman ended up giving her only 6 points, which threw Draco a little. In his eyes, she had performed just as well as Diggory, if not better. He would not have put Bagman, of all people, for that strict a judge. His attention was diverted, though, when the keepers brought in the next dragon. This one was slightly smaller in size than the others had been, and of a bright red color. A Chinese fireball. Crouch blew his whistle, and Bagman called, "And here comes Mr. Crumb!" Draco cursed under his breath, and Hermione held his hand a little tighter. Of course Harry was last. Fate needed Draco to die of nerves, after all. Victor's face was serene as he stepped out of the tent, but unlike the other two, he did not look scared. Draco held a newfound respect for this recent addition to his circle of friends. The way Victor handled both the pressure and the threat of danger was indeed remarkable. Like Delacour before him, Victor did not lose any time. He immediately pointed his wand at the dragon and shot a spell. It hit the dragon right between her eyes, and she howled in pain. She thrashed and spit fire in random directions, front paws clawing at her face, but Victor was already moving, dodging her to get to the nest. He managed to retrieve the golden egg just before the dragon stomped down onto the egg right next to it, breaking its shell. Draco flinched, and the dragon keepers immediately intervened, leading an agonized dragon away before she did any more damage to her own eggs. Victor, on the other hand, remained unharmed and stayed to await the jury's judgment. At first, his marks seemed about identical to Diggory's, 8 from Maxine and Dumbledore, 7 from Crouch and Bagman, which Draco, despite his slight bias, perceived as fair. While Diggory had been hurt, Victor had ended up damaging the eggs. In Draco's opinion, Delacour's had been the best performance yet. That was until it was Karkaroff's turn to give judgment, though. With a booming smile, he conjured a large, shimmering 10 to hover in the air, and Draco rolled his eyes. As happy as he was to have a friend in lead, it was so obvious what Karkaroff was doing. This was exactly why this jury system was corrupt. Draco had no time to judge Karkaroff further, though, because then the Dragon Keepers let in the last dragon, and Draco's heart stopped. This creature was larger than the preceding ones, and she was already spewing flames in all directions, aggressively defending herself from any approach. Her scales were mud brown and covered with sharp horns the size of Draco's wand, enough to pierce the skin of every wizard approaching her. She threateningly swung her tail at one of the keepers, who was just able to dodge the assault and avoid being punctured. "Oh, God!" Hermione moaned. "I can't watch this!" Draco choked out. down! She hissed, her fingers tightening to the point of pain. Draco felt eyes on his face, and he looked up to catch Weasley's gaze. The ginger git had turned towards them, his freckled skin almost green, an expression of horror on his face. He opened his mouth to say something, but Draco sneered at him and spat. Don't you dare act like you care now, Weasley, or I swear I will hex you right this instant! Draco! Hermione sighed. Please, not now! Weasley had closed his mouth again, but he was still looking at them, conflict written all over his features. He only turned at the sound of Crouch's whistle. And last but not least, Bagman's voice carried through the enclosure, our youngest champion, Harry Potter! The sound Draco let out was close to a whine, and Hermione's free hand grabbed his arm, apparently in need of further support. He can do this, she muttered despite her obvious fear. He's prepared, and he's got an undeniable knack for survival. He will be fine. Draco could not speak. His eyes were glued to the entrance of the white tent, and then the flap lifted and his best friend stepped out. The look on Harry's face was one he had seen before plenty of times. It was the same expression he had worn when they had made their way down the trapdoor to retrieve the Philosopher's Stone, or when he had run to save Sirius only a couple of months ago. There was fear, yes, and nerves, but they were subdued by determination and purpose in a way Draco knew he himself would never quite be able to manage. It was something inherent to Harry, this kind of courage and calm in the face of danger. For a moment, Harry just stood, taking in the scene in front of him, but then he raised his wand. Accio Firebolt! He called. Draco held his breath as they waited. Time seemed to stand still. Hermione was still clinging to him, and he could feel her fingers tightening momentarily, but he did not feel any pain. His whole being was focused on Harry down in the enclosure. And then he saw the broom appear in the distance. Relief spread through Draco, and he took a shaky breath, feeling lightheaded from the lack of oxygen. The crowds were shouting around them, and Bagman was yelling, but Draco couldn't focus on anything but Harry. Harry mounted his broom, and then he was up into the air, and just like that, all the tension seemed to leave Harry's body. Draco had always known that he was a natural-born flyer, had always loved watching Harry on the pitch, but it was something else, watching Harry descend towards the dragon as if the creature was nothing but an opposing player in a match, needing to be outflown. The noises around Draco returned to him as if a bubble of nerves had burst, and he could hear the cheers of the crowd. In the row in front of him, Weasley was on his feet shouting, Yes! That's it! Come on, Harry! Bagman was almost wetting himself at the jury table, yelling, Great Scott! He can fly! Are you watching this, Mr. Grum? Harry was, in want of a stronger word, absolutely marvelous! He lured the dragon into the air through intricate maneuvers and dodged each flame expertly. Draco was just starting to feel confident, opening his mouth to cheer Harry on with the rest of the crowd when the dragon lashed out for Harry with her tail and hit! Both Hermione and Ginny screamed at his side, and Draco was frozen, watching as if in slow motion as Harry held himself on his broom, zooming out of reach. There was a cut on his shoulder, and blood was staining his torn robes, but he was gritting his teeth and holding himself steady on his broom. The injury did not deter Harry from his strategy. He continued luring the dragon up into the air and away from her eggs until finally it worked. The majestic horntail spread her wings and rose up into the air the same moment as Harry dove down. Due to her size, Harry was much agiler than her and able to dodge her easily, and then before Draco knew it, he had picked up the egg and was soaring away out of reach. The crowd was out of control, cheering so loudly that it deafened Draco to all of the noise. But he had eyes only for Harry. He watched as the other boy landed near the entrance to the enclosure where he was welcomed by McGonagall, Hagrid, and Moody. They led him into the tent and out of sight. He did it! Hermione squealed, shaking Draco. He did it, and he was great! He was, Draco agreed, his voice still shaky. I can't believe it. Come on, Hermione called, pulling him to his feet. Let's go! She led Draco down the steps and out of the stands until they had reached the tent, which was still guarded by McGonagall, Hagrid, and Moody. Moody's good eye was fixed on Draco as they approached, but he ignored him in favor of Hagrid, who was grinning brightly and nodding towards the tent entrance. They did not falter in their steps as they burst in, only coming to a halt once inside. The inside of the tent seemed to be some kind of makeshift infirmary. Madame Pomfrey was bustling around in a cubicle that seemed to hold Diggory, at least judging from the shadows that they threw on the curtains. Harry, meanwhile, was stepping out of a second cubicle. His robes were still torn and bloody where the horntail had hit his shoulder, but from the way he moved, Draco could tell that the wound had already been healed. Before Harry could even open his mouth to greet them, Draco had his arms around him. "I'm so glad you're okay!" He breathed, his fingers still trembling as he clung to Harry's robes. "Merlin, I was so scared!" "You were brilliant!" Hermione squealed. "You were amazing! You really were!" "Incredible!" Draco agreed, finally letting go of him to let Hermione have her hug. "If the jury judges you fairly, you'll be right up at the top somewhere!" Harry smiled at him over Hermione's bushy head, opening his mouth to return something, but the words were lost to the flap of the tent entrance lifting as a fourth person entered. Draco's eyes narrowed when he realized it was none other than Weasley, face pale and shoulders hunched as he lingered in the entranceway looking at Harry hesitantly. "What are you doing here?" Draco snapped. "Draco!" Hermione hissed, her hand catching his wrist to restrain him. Weasley gulped once, but otherwise ignored Draco's jab, instead addressing Harry directly. "Harry," he said, "whoever put your name in that goblet, I reckon they're trying to do you in." Draco couldn't help it. He laughed, rather bitterly. "Really?" he demanded. "Now you come around? After weeks of being a complete arse!" "Draco!" Hermione cut him off rather sharply. "What?" he hissed. "It's true!" A tense silence spread out between them, and Weasley was studying his shoes, his ears a bright red. Eventually, he took a deep breath and opened his mouth again, but he did not get to speak because Harry was quicker. "It's okay," he said, making Draco whirl around and stare at him incredulously. "Forget it." "No," Weasley protested. "I should have forget it," Harry insisted, a determination in his voice that told Draco that there was no arguing with him, no matter how much Draco might have wanted to. While Weasley and Harry grinned awkwardly at each other, Hermione let go of Draco's wrist and burst into tears. She hugged both of them, whining about how stupid they were before escaping through the tent flaps to have her emotional breakdown somewhere else. Draco rolled his eyes. They were stupid indeed, the both of them, though Draco's reasoning behind that conclusion quite differed from Hermione's. The three of them left the tent together, Weasley chattering on about the performances of the other three champions, all the time ignoring the way Draco glowered at him from Harry's other side. The insufferable redhead only shut up when they reached the edge of the enclosure, signaling the judges that Harry was ready to receive his marks. Draco held his breath, staring the judges down. He had claimed again and again that he did not care about the outcome of this tournament as long as Harry got out of it alive, and he stood by his words. But now that his friend had survived his first task, he might as well be rewarded for it. Madame Maxime was, again, the first one to reveal her points. She raised her wand up in the air, and a large silvery 8 appeared. "No bad," Weasley called. "I suppose you took marks off for your shoulder." Next was Crouch, who awarded Harry 9 points. He received the same marks from Dumbledore. Then it was Bagman's turn, and Draco's eyes widened as he conjured a large silvery 10. "10?" Harry asked incredulously. "But I got hurt. What's he playing at?" "Harry, don't complain!" Weasley called cheerfully, but Draco was quite in agreement with Harry. Bagman had been horribly strict with the other champions, his points never exceeding 7. He was showing a bias that was terribly obvious, and Draco had to wonder why. He could not voice any of this aloud, though, because then Karkaroff was raising his wand, and Draco knew what was going to happen even before the large 4 appeared over his head. "What?" Weasley called angrily. "4? You lousy biased scumbag! You gave Crumb a 10! As Weasley kept cursing, and Harry laughed, seeming far too pleased with Weasley's anger as long as it was for his sake. Draco wished that he had taken off with Hermione earlier. He suddenly felt like a fifth wheel, and it made his contempt for Weasley grow beyond words.